Number 10, the cutting edge. So I feel like I have to start here because this really was the prima donna of the revolution. One of the reasons the French Revolution became such a bloody event was due to the guillotine. It became the primary symbol of the French Revolution as the peasants exacted revenge on the aristocracy. It became known as the National Razor and Madame la Guillotine. Prior to the events of the revolution, executions were much more violent and cruel, if you can believe that. One involved quartering, which we won't get into, but you can imagine how bad that is if you take that literally. But Dr. Joseph Guillotin, a member of the French National Assembly, argued that there should be a painless and private capital punishment, and even argued against capital punishment in general. He didn't want it to happen. So Dr. Guillotin, along with a German and a harpsichord maker, Tobias Schmidt, invented the first prototype for the death machine. From there, the rest was history. It is estimated over 40,000 people were executed à la razor during the Reign of Terror. Pretty bad for a guy who really didn't want it to happen, but hey, at least it was painless. If the blade was sharp. If it wasn't, ugh. Number 9, the national anthem. You know what's funny about going to theater school is that the more you learn, the more your teachers are like, hey, if something bad happens to you, you can use it. It's fuel for your art. Which is immediately what I thought of when I heard this story. Which is why, to me, it kind of makes sense that the origins of the French national anthem happened during the French Revolution. They used their pain to make something good. Going through something dramatic? Sing about it. The monarchies of Europe were pretty pissed about the fact that they were killing a bunch of their friends and loved ones, so they formed a coalition to defeat the resistance and restore the monarchy. The French Baron Philippe Friedrich Dietrich requested that Rouget de Lille, another French officer, compose a song that would rally the troops. So he wrote the first anthem, called Chant de guerre pour l'armée de Rhin, which translates to War for the Army of Rhin. Volunteers carried the anthem all through the streets of Paris as they marched on the capital. The song title got subbed out for the simpler one called the Marseillaise, which became the Republic's anthem in 1795. And now, even today, it is the national anthem of France. Number 8, the tennis court oath. You'd think it would be like at a pub or on the street. Why I think that, I don't know, but it wasn't. One of the earliest acts of defiance in the French Revolution took place on a tennis court of all places. To say that Louis XVI was ill-equipped to handle the financial debt that his father and his grandfather built prior to his reign is kind of, well, it's an understatement. He had no clue. He made a desperate attempt in 1789 to address the economic issues by assembling the Estates Generales. It was a national assembly with 3 factions, each one representing either the nobles, the clergy, and the commoners. The third estates, which is the commoners, had the most members and declared themselves the National Assembly. There was a long list of overdue grievances, and they declared that they would force a new constitution on the king. Initially things were looking up as Louis legalized the assembly, but he locked them out of the damn meeting. So they moved to an indoor tennis court and took an oath to never disband until a new written constitution was formed for France. But very soon after that, they stormed the Bastille. But we'll get to the Bastille later. Number 7, the Reformation. The Renaissance was all about resurgence and coming out of the dark, quite literally after the Dark Ages. A rebirth. The Reformation was a period of religious, political, and cultural upheaval that shattered Catholic Europe. Some of the ideas, structures, and beliefs would lay the foundation for what would build the continent for the modern era. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and even Henry VIII began challenging the papal authority and started questioning the Catholic Church's ability to define practice. Henry divorced from the church to marry Anne Boleyn, as we know, creating a new religion altogether, becoming head of church. With the invention of the Gutenberg press, as I mentioned, pages of the Bible were finally able to be placed into the hands of the people to read and form opinions, but this massive series of disruptions erupted in wars and violence, mostly between the Catholics and the Protestants, but it really changed the world.
At number 6, Belladonna. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't make it any less poisonous. This plant is one of the most toxic plants around, but that doesn't mean people haven't tried to use it for their own personal use. Normally we want to stay away from toxic things like chemicals and X's, but back in the Renaissance, people said full send and used belladonna as eye drops. Yeah, that's right. Even though this is literally poisonous, they thought, let's put it in our eyeballs, the organs we use to see, because that's a bright idea, right? Many people, mostly women, used eye drops made out of deadly nightshade because it changed the size of their pupils to make them look more starry-eyed, and that was seen as a beauty trend. In moderation, these eye drops wouldn't cause too much damage, but prolonged use of the poison could cause some serious health concerns like stiff muscles, short-term memory loss, confusion, disorientation, and in some cases death, because it could literally paralyze your heart. And if you're thinking, man, I'm so glad we don't do that anymore, then think again, baby, because if you've ever been to the optometrist to get your pupils dilated, well, guess what they use? That's right, Belladonna. It's not harmful to put a couple drops in your eyes and to not do it again for a while, but if you get your hands on it and start using it too much and in high doses, then you're in for some trouble.
Number 5. The rise of the Medicis. The Medici legacy stretches all the way back to the 12th century, but come the Renaissance, they really came into the spotlight. The House of Medici first attained wealth and political power in Florence in the 13th century, but in the 1400s, Cosimo de' Medici, later known as Cosimo the Elder, started a legacy that would go down in history. They were massive supporters of the arts and humanities and were one of the main reasons Florence became the cradle of the Renaissance. This immensely powerful family produced not one, but 4 popes: Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo XI. Their family dynasty lasted over 3 centuries. The last Medici royal failed to produce a male heir, and that's why it ended. Leo X was one pope who brought back something called indulgences, essentially a pay-to-play ticket to heaven. He also basically bankrupted the Vatican with his endless spending, so it was a lot of drama there, a lot of scandal. Ooh.
Number 4. Plague cures. When the plague, or the Black Death, swept through Europe in the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, people didn't really know what to do to cure people of the sickness. I mean, they didn't have the same medical advancements that we do today, so they came up with some pretty creative theories on how to cure the Black Death. Were they effective? I don't know. Ask the millions of people who died of the plague. Some of the quote-unquote cures for the Black Death included snuggling up to a live chicken, because it was believed that the chicken would draw pestilence out of your body. It was also suggested that those infected with the plague drink a glass of their own pee twice a day. Or you could pluck the chicken that you were just spooning and put his bare, freshly plucked chicken butt on the plague spots to heal them. Clearly these things didn't actually work, since around 25 million people died of the plague, and it absolutely decimated Florence, one of the elite cities of the Renaissance.
Number 3. Charlotte Corday, assassin of Marat. So we have established a couple things. One is that the French Revolution was bloody, relentless, and pretty terrifying. As much as it proved the statement that people shouldn't be afraid of their governments, but the other way around, Alan Moore, V for Vendetta, it wasn't a great place to be. Enter Charlotte Corday. Charlotte was a passionate supporter of the revolution, even though its main conspirators were set on killing the likes of her. Charlotte was, after all, a noblewoman, though she opposed the Reign of Terror. There were 2 sides to the fray, the Girondists and the Jacobins, and Charlotte fought alongside the first, the Girondists. But the Jacobins were radical and tried to kill any and all oppositionists, the Girondists included, which is why Charlotte decided that Jean-Paul Marat, leader of the Jacobins, had to be taken out. She became an assassin. While Marat was taking a bath, Charlotte stormed in. She'd bought a knife and, disguised as an informant, went in to speak with him. She said she had news. At first, she delivered on her offer and told him of the escaped Girondists. He at once said that they would be guillotined, and so she whipped out her knife and popped his bath bubbles for good. Corday knew she was going to be caught, however, and had told no one, not even her family, her plan, so they wouldn't stop her. Charlotte was guillotined July 17, 1793, with her name attached to her dress so she would be recognized. She wrote in a letter explaining her actions, "I desire only that my head, carried through Paris, may be a rallying standard for all the friends of the law." Number 2. Public zoo! Did you know that in the middle of all that crazy turmoil and public executions, they managed to find time to open a public zoo? In 1793, the National Assembly declared that all privately owned exotic animals will be transferred to the menagerie at the Palace of Versailles, or killed, stuffed, and donated to scientists. Gladly though, the animals' lives were spared and the menagerie was reopened as a zoo. It was free to the public and peasants got to go see exotic animals for the first time. Jacques-Henri Bernardin de Saint-Pierre Robespierre, the founder, passionately believed that the public should be educated about exotic animals. Now, I can't be sure how well the animals were treated, I assume it wasn't very great, but this was technically the first zoo. Number 1. Maximilien Robespierre. Now, it only seems fitting that we end this list at the end. Maximilien Robespierre started out with good intentions, but even though the revolution was about the dismantling of power, Maximilian became corrupted by it. Yes, he did topple the monarchy and put the power back to the people, but then he took it back for himself and got a little crazy, you know, the whole thing. Robespierre worked as a lawyer in France and focused a lot of his cases towards the underprivileged classes. This got him a lot of popularity, and he eventually rose to be the poster child of the revolution, the leader of the revolution. He became the head of public safety after Louis and Marie lost their heads, and continued to accuse many members of the National Convention of treasonous and unrevolutionary activities all over the place. Remember the whole thing between the Girondists and the Jacobins? This was that. In less than a year, 300,000 people were arrested, 10,000 died in prison, and 17,000 were guillotined. I think those numbers might be slightly off, but that's kind of what the research said. One by one, he sent them all to the guillotine until he eventually was elected the president of the National Convention. Within 6 days, he passed a law that suspended the right to a public trial and to legal assistance, and by the end of that month, 1,400 were guillotined. Talk about trigger happy. Finally, the right and the left had to reunite in order to overthrow him, and he was eventually met the blade himself. Kind of crazy how full circle that is.
Number 10. No calling, no gifts. This is a time in history when men were told to be gentlemen and women told to be ladies. Naturally, that came with some weird social practices. For instance, women were discouraged from accepting gifts from men. Personally, I like to give my girlfriend flowers and chocolate. I'm a classic guy, what can I say? Can't go wrong with that. However, even if a handsome silver-tongued devil such as myself were to give some flowers and the finest dark chocolate a 7-Eleven has to offer, and a most promising woman were to accept said gifts, she may not be able to call me back. Literally because, well, the phone isn't exactly a thing yet, and also because that's something else women were just discouraged from doing. Call on a man? No way, Jose! Even if he is super nice and waiting for a genuine response. One etiquette guidebook from 1882 called any woman who calls on a man ill-bred and positively improper to do so. I like when people give me flowers and chocolate. Maybe call me sometimes, I'm a little lonely. Number 9. Act like a lady. How dare ladies do anything unladylike? Ugh, said every man ever in the Victorian era. This is a time in history when ladies gotta be ladylike. That means makeup, corsets, and don't you dare do anything masculine. Oh, that's me angry. This is still a time when food isn't the greatest either, so imagine if you got an upset tummy at the dinner table. Happens to me a lot. You've got a handsome prince that your parents have arranged for you to marry. When you go to greet him, you do it with a simple gesture, as kneeling to curtsy could turn your linens a certain shade of embarrassment that 1800 stain cleaning technology could never wash away. You'd poop yourself. Where's Billy Mays when you need him, right? How dare women do such things as go number 2, or even worse, break wind? Oh, the nerve! That's just the way it went, folks. I don't make the rules. Number 8. Charged with love. Naturally, this was the past, and not being open to homosexuality was just the way it was. Especially when tucking yourself into bed at night alone wasn't allowed either. Homosexuality just wasn't gonna happen. They just weren't gonna be approved of it. It's just how it goes. It sucks. However, it's almost as if there's been love on this earth since day one, and to stop that kind of love, it's just silly, man. Wherever I go, everyone is welcome on this channel, or my Twitch. Chetty loves everyone, because in reality, this is a time period where you could wind up in jail for that kind of love. And as Austin Powers would say, that's just not very groovy, baby, yeah. Strangely enough, homosexual relationships between women might have been completely overlooked, as they were sometimes mistaken for women being friends. Yeah, I know. Some women even lived together, but given that they probably needed each other for financial support, people just kind of thought that's how it went, and they ignored it. It's like they live together, and like you start putting the pieces together, and it's like, you know, I don't know, something weird going on there. But love everybody, come on, be nice.
Number 7, give us bread! The French Revolution very much erupted due to the financial distress of the people, but the tipping point was the moment bread became unattainable to the common Parisian. Bread is a huge thing in France, and it was a huge kind of staple meal for every Parisian. Marie Antoinette's famous misquoted response to the people asking for bread was, "Let them eat cake." Though it's debated whether she actually said that, it does summarize this yeasty flashpoint in history. They should have known better. In 1529, riots over grain and the Great Rebellion led to thousands of peasants destroying houses of the rich, all in the name of grain. But they didn't listen to their history, they made it worse. The king was counseled by the physiocrats since the 1760s, who firmly believed that the wealth of the nation was derived solely from the value of the land. Therefore, agricultural products should be highly priced. So they tried to intermittently deregulate the domestic trade to introduce free trade, but needless to say, they failed so hard. They caused food shortages and skyrocketed prices, which erupted in the Flour War over 300 riots to pillage grain in 1775. Layers and layers of tensions were added, along with other economic distress and all this stuff added to the fuel of the blaze that would be later the French Revolution. Number 6. Flip a coin. Now, the royal family obviously didn't go willingly to their deaths. They at first tried to escape. As I previously mentioned, bread was a big deal, and on October 5th, 1789, a large crowd of mostly women began to assemble at the markets. Why were they there? To discuss the steep price of bread. But they were dismissed, so they marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles and stormed the place. They took out several guards and chanted over and over to the king, "Live among the people." Louis conceded, he said yeah okay, and agreed to go with them to Paris, agreed, kind of. But meanwhile, the royal family was placed under protection, and on the night of June 1971, the nobles dressed as their servants and their servants dressed as them, and the nobles made an attempt to escape to Austria. Now, if it were 2021, the king would probably have some arrogant social media so everyone would know what he looked like, but the commoners outside didn't. They had no pictures of him, so it was the perfect disguise. But his face was on every coin in France, and it was because of this he was recognized at the border and sent back. Now we know what happened next. Number 5. Last words. While she was alive, Marie Antoinette was abhorred, absolutely detested, they hated her. But funny enough, today she's incredibly well loved. Historians believe that due to rumors and hatred of the time, her character was misinterpreted. What do I think? Well, she was the product of the aristocracy that pretty much poisoned their own well. She was a bystander. But one of the moments that leads people to believe in her kinder nature was her last words. As Marie Antoinette walked up to the guillotine on October 16, 1793, she stepped on the foot of her executioner by accident. Some say it was something else, but either way, her last words were reported as, "I'm sorry." Number 4. The Bastille. Bastille, Bastille, Bastille. What am I talking about? It seems wrong not to mention one of the most pivotal moments in the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. Peasants rose up and literally stormed the most famous prison in France. But what you may not know is that they destroyed that building with their own bare hands. They tore it brick from brick because they didn't have any explosives. The Bastille was a fearsome 100 feet high, 8-towered prison that became a symbol for the tyranny of the aristocrats. So it was only natural that they would take out their anger on this place. At dawn on July 14th, a crowd armed with only muskets, swords, makeshift weapons gathered around the Bastille. Their intent was to demand the ammunition stored there from the governor of the prison, the Marquis de Lanay. He and his men were eventually overwhelmed and the people stormed it. Lanay raised a white flag and surrendered. He and his men were taken into custody, gunpowder and cannons were seized, and 7 prisoners were freed. Lanay was destroyed by the mob before he even met trial. This pivotal moment in history is celebrated as the French national holiday, even today.
Number 3. The Kensington System. Poor Queen Victoria. I know this is kind of a stretch, but it relates back to the whole mistreating women thing. But basically it was something implemented in order to control the young royal, make her dependent on her mother, whom she was not allowed to be without. Basically modern day strict parents. Now, all the kids watching right now, or all the kids who've grown up, how well did that parenting work? Let us know in the comments. I'm willing to bet it created a little bit of a divide between parent and child, am I right? That's exactly what happened with Queen Victoria. Shouldn't be surprised, really. Being a parent is tough. I get that, but squeeze too hard and the sand falls through the cracks of your hand. Victoria wasn't even allowed an hour to herself, and I don't care who you are, no matter how charismatic or bubbly, Everybody needs some alone time. Number 2, a healthy breakfast. Okay, not Victorian London, but this is just too funny not to mention, and it's around the same time period, very close. As the great minds of the time thought, self-pollution was a big no-no, and the reason for these urges was often related to food. Some thought eating meat would make you down bad, so a man named John Harvey Kellogg, you might have heard of him, aimed to cure the sickness of self-love. What if a man had a delicious, nutritious meal to eat, especially at the start of his day? Cornflakes by Kellogg's, the very same cereal that's probably sitting on top of your fridge, yeah, was partially originally designed to stop you from feeling those carnal urges. Now, not sure if that works. I mean, go ahead and tell me how you feel after eating a bowl of that. I had one this morning. I feel fine. I don't feel any different at all. I mean, I'm just, well, not really feeling the same about Pam Anderson anymore though. Number 1, rising action. This could get some married couples into some trouble if they're watching, so sorry. It's gonna be hard to talk about this without saying it because YouTube will send a stern letter if I do, but here it goes. The deed was not considered done unless both parties had signed off on it, had their toes curled, reaching the peak, your magnum opus, the way I feel when I eat at McDonald's, DEFCON 1, or simply mispronouncing organisms in health class. I feel like once you're involved, and to me that's a done deal. You can't really reverse it from that point on, regardless of any of my euphemisms, but that's what they thought. They thought if you both didn't climb that mountain together, it didn't happen. 'Cause science.
At number 10, witch trials. We've talked about witch trials before in reference to the Dark Ages, but now let's talk about when witch trials really picked up in the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, the idea of witchcraft was a thing, but it wasn't really seen as that much of a threat. Back then it was believed to be pagan superstition and the devil trying to plague humanity, but with the Reformation of the Catholic Church, it was argued that witchcraft had increased and that harsher penalties were needed, especially for women, because why the heck not? Witch hunts and trials started to pick up more and more, especially in southern Germany and the British Isles. Thousands of men, women, and children were tried and executed for witchcraft, though many historians believe that most people confessing to being a witch was because of the mental exhaustion that came from their torture. But speaking of torture, we have to talk about how people got the truth out of those accused. There were many devices used to torture potential witches, like the breast ripper, pretty self-explanatory there, hot stools, and sharp metal devices. What sucks is that when witch trials picked up in the Renaissance, they didn't really die down until around the 1750s, so being accused of practicing the dark arts was a basic part of society for far too long.
Number 9, printing. We can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about the Gutenberg press. I'm sorry, we just can't. Is it unusual? Not particularly, but is it true? Yes. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg introduced the first mechanical printing press to Germany and changed the world forever. With his invention, the spread of information and ideas allowed the Renaissance to blossom. Books were cheaper to own because they didn't have to be handwritten out, or like stamped one by one. One of the first things he printed was the Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible. When the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, prompting Greek creators and thinkers to move westward, the printing press aided in making their ideas spread across Europe. With the printing of the Bible and easier access to broader thoughts, this threatened certain power structures that banked on the ignorance of their followers. In 1501, Pope Alexander VI promised excommunication for anyone who printed manuscripts without the church's approval. I wonder why. But by that point, it was already far too late. People were obsessed with ideas, and it's all thanks to the printing press.
At number 8, rotten teeth. In these modern times, looks mean a lot. Lots of people get work done to look quote-unquote perfect, but back in the Renaissance, their idea of looking good was very different. Today, a lot of people want that perfect smile. To achieve the perfect straight white teeth that so many people desire, people get braces, use whitening products, and even get veneers to look good, but in the old days, having that perfect smile would be a sign that you had no money. That's right, in the Renaissance, the way of showing how much money you had was by showing how rotten your teeth were. This all became a thing because of sugar. When it was introduced to Europeans in the Renaissance, the wealthy bought it all up and they used it in a wide variety of things, but this also caused health problems like rotting teeth. But because they were rich and held a lot of power in society, having gross teeth became a trend, and so to follow it, people started making their own teeth look rotten by painting them black so they looked like they had been dining on sugar even if they had never seen it before. Now in retrospect it might sound bizarre, but what I'm most fixated on is how bad everyone's breath would smell with everyone walking around with rotten teeth. Ew.
Number 7. A good thing. If I'm talking about medieval times, there's a good chance I'm gonna bring up the super not cool, not fun, do not condone or support the behavior of marrying a woman at the age of 12. Yucky. In part 1 I mentioned that there was a ton of corners and streets being worked by the only other job besides street cleaners at 3 AM by women. However, after venereal disease was becoming a serious issue, it was getting pretty bad. It was becoming clear that a lot of people who were getting sick were young women, like 11 to 16 age group. Ooh. Which I shouldn't have to tell you is bad. That's pretty bad, dude. When I was 16, I was rocking Black Ops 2, hanging out with my buddies, and partying hard in the summer. I got a lot of good stories, maybe I'll share them one day. Catching all that nasty stuff is no way to spend your youth, so thank God the government changed the age of consent to 16 years old, which I know is not a solution for everything that was going on, but it was a small step forward in the right direction. That's what we like, good history moving forward. We like that, Chetty likes. Number 6, the seamstress. Being that the Industrial Revolution had started and business was booming, people needed to travel for business, or more specifically, men needed to travel for business, which means they gotta be away from their wives, and that means they are away from the very thing we're talking about today, bedroom stuff. How did men solve this issue? Well, there was no shortage of ladies roaming street corners to aid in that matter. However, there's an option with a little less syphilis. There were aids or early blow-up dolls called travel ladies. Strangely enough, it was stored in a gentleman's hat. What? That's so wrong. Once it was ready to be used, it was inflated and reassembled. This is a quote from an ad from one of the products. It is inflated to the essential part of the woman wanted by a man. That just doesn't sound very good. This is why we have boards of people to check stuff from products before it gets shipped out to the public. I feel like that just wouldn't fly very well today. Number 5. Big polluter. This just doesn't make any sense. It never did to me, and it still doesn't. But in case you didn't know, self-pleasure was a big no-no, commonly called self-pollution, which honestly is very funny to me. That's just hilarious. Don't self-pollute yourself, Chris. That's bad. Don't do that. That's naughty. It was a sin and thought to be a cause for many ailments. I'm sure you've heard the classic saying that for guys, if you decided to go bump in the night by yourself, there's a good chance you'd need a walking stick because it would make you go blind. Women were also targeted, however, as for any pearl polishing by women was thought to be hysteric and needed to be treated for such. Look, the truth is, any man who wants to wax his carrot or woman tuning a one-dial radio should be able to do so without judgment of society or medical remedies of snake oil doctors. Love yourself, love everybody else, and just as long as the bedroom door's closed, you're good. Just don't do it in public, you're good. Number 4, shake and bake. I'm something of a scientist myself, but that doesn't mean I know everything, and if you actually need to learn something about health and safety, take it from a professional, not a second-rate John Candy. However, when coming across this fact, I just had to share it, because with my medical knowledge, this just doesn't sound right. Alright, so kids, we know how they're made. I don't need to go into detail for that. However, there was this idea back in the Victorian days that if a woman danced shortly after doing what mommy and daddies do, then there was a chance that her pregnancy just wouldn't happen. Or perhaps more commonly after riding a horse. Same idea. Okay. Which is frankly horse. I mean, come on. My mom always told me when she was baking that I had to be quiet and stop running around the house or the cake she was baking wouldn't rise. Well, they always did. I love chocolate cake. I mean, really, I do. I'm starting to wonder if there's a connection here. I was a rowdy kid.
Number 3, the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Not only unusual, but incredibly terrifying. Hands down, not a good time to be alive. The period lasted for over 200 years. Basically, it was a purge of non-believers by the Vatican, especially those in the Jewish community. Thomas de Torquemada was one such man during the event who played the role as Grand Inquisitor. If you weren't Catholic, you were given two choices. 1. Convert. Or 2. Be burned at the stake for heresy, or tormented/tortured. There really was no in between. He, along with many others, used cruel measures of torment such as hanging, burning, suffocating, the rack, and even waterboarding to extract confessions. Nobody knows precisely how many died in total, but it's presumed to be over 30,000 people, with Thomas executing and tormenting over 2,000 that he oversaw.
At number 2, prayer timer. Back in the Renaissance, technology wasn't really doing it to them, so things like clocks weren't something that everyone had. Clocks were around, but they were quite expensive and they were rarely accurate, so they were essentially pointless. So how do they tell time? Well, some would use the sun to indicate the time, but again, it was more of a generalization, not very accurate. And others would use the chimes of church bells, but for small things like timing something for 5-10 minutes, people in the Renaissance used a very different method, and that was prayer. In a book of beauty and household tips, it was advised that you time things based on prayers. So for example, a recipe might call for you to recite 2 Our Father prayers as a basis of how long you should let something sit. Again, it might not have been very accurate because people speak at different speeds, but when you don't have a clock or a stove timer, you have to get pretty creative for telling time.
And last but not least, we have St. Bartholomew's Massacre. As we now know from some of the other points on this list, there was a lot of religious tension between in the Renaissance. The event took place on August 23rd to 24th in 1572. King Charles IX of France, persuaded by his mother Catherine de Medici, remember the Medicis, ordered the assassination of Huguenot Protestant leaders in Paris. What came as a result was an absolute bloodbath. Mobs of French Catholics took the lives of Protestants, but it's all Catherine's doing. Had previously tried to remove Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, whom she believed was leading her son into war with Spain, which she was not into. But he was only wounded, and Charles was dedicated to finding out who was behind it. So instead, to cover her tracks, his mother used it to convince him the Protestants were responsible. So he authorized taking the lives of their leaders, just like that. Listen to mom. She implicated Coligny, which resulted in him being the first to be beaten and then tossed out of his own bedroom window. Thus the fray began. An estimated 3,000 French Protestants were taken out in Paris, but the total countrywide was over 70,000 people.